Well, first I just want to thank Donna for reading such a long piece of scripture. So thank you. The narrative lectionary that we read out of sometimes gives us short pieces and sometimes gives us chunks of the story. And you know, the story of Noah is like 4 or 5 chapters long. So there's a lot to it. And in fact, it's 2 stories. It's 2 separate stories interwoven. We know that because sometimes they're talking about 2 animals, 2 by 2, and sometimes they're talking about 7 clean animals and 2 unclean animals. It's just, you know that, and in fact, there's 2 different gods mentioned. There's God, and then there's the Lord God, or Yahweh, and Elohim. And so these are 2 stories woven together. And so to get some good chunks of it so we can hear the story again in our minds and hearts, we have to read a lot. Thanks, Donna, for stepping up to that. And I even added more for her on it spontaneously this morning. There's so much cool stuff to latch onto in the story of Noah. There's, as I said, 2 stories, maybe 2 gods or 2 different personalities of one God. We're not sure how that works. There's an ark. Where else do you get an ark? Right? Only mentioned twice in the Bible. This ark and the Ark of the Covenant. Different types of arks. The animals, of course, 2 by 2 or 7 or all that kind of stuff. You can remember the Irish Rovers singing about the unicorns. Right? That's Shel Silverstein. There's the flooding from above and below. I was reminded this week that not just the rains fell, but great chasms opened in the earth and springs came up. So there's water coming from below and above to get the job done in 40 days. We often get fixated on what's wrong, on the wrong part of the story, though. We often get fixated on those little details. And of course, a number of times this week I was reminded by how many nurseries we have that are decorated with the story of the flood. Any of you had a nursery in your home when you had little kids and stuff, and you put up, I know my kids' nursery had Noah's Ark in it, because we like the animals, right? And we like the rainbow. It's a good color scheme. All the animals are really cute and all that kind of stuff. But that's us getting confused or kind of fixed on the wrong part of the story. We should forget whether it's a historical story or not. We should forget how it compares to the other flood narratives. Because, you know, all over Mesopotamia, Persia, and Palestine at that time, everybody had a flood story. There are a dime a dozen. Every faith group had different flood story with some similarities. Now, we could get caught up on, well, there's all these other flood narratives, and do they have one universal truth that we can think about here and there? No, forget it. And forget about finding the ark. I mean, we could try, and they have tried. Leo knows that. They try and find the ark all the time, right? Like they think they found Mount Ararat, and they dig down, forget about all that. It's the wrong thing to concentrate on. Because this is, in fact, a story about the God of Israel. It's a proclamation or a type of announcement. In this story, it's announced that God has powerful ways to bring the world to God's vision of unity and harmony and order. It's a disclosure about God. It's a disclosure that is very unique to this God of Israel. And every time we say God of Israel, I want you to remember the God of Jesus, the one we follow. So not a distant God. The God of Israel, the God of Jesus, the one we follow. This story is a proclamation, an announcement, a disclosure of God's very character to the world. It's a story about the fracture between the Creator and the creature, God and humanity. The creature has refused to be God's creature. It says there's great evil in the world, and there's this whole mix-up thing about the Nephilim, the sons of God, having babies with the women of humanity, and it's all very interesting. Sometimes it says giants, sometimes it says Nephilim, and these are where the heroes come from. And that's the whole thing about Goliath. They think Goliath was one of the leftovers. I don't know how that works after the flood, but anyway, moving on. See how much cool stuff there is in the story? Even I'm just going off over here. You're like, Dave, get back to what, right, okay. It's about a fracture between the Creator and the creature. Humanity, God found out did not want to live out God's dreams for the world. A dream of unity and love and compassion and peace. They were going in the opposite direction. The noble decisions of God, as one writer said this week, the noble decisions of God have been treated shabbily by humanity. God holds a great expectation for the world at the beginning of this story, since the Adam and Eve event. And we learn in this story, God will not abandon that hope and expectation. More than the fracture, though, this is a story of the deep pathos, the emotional condition of God. It says this in verse 6 of chapter 6. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. How many people thought this was about God's anger? How many times have you thought that the flood story was a time when God got really, really, really angry? No. This is in fact a story about God's great sadness and God's great grief at what was going on. It says a number of times God felt sorry about the creation of humankind, and it grieved God right to the core of his heart. A significant question for us as faithful in this story is, can God change God's mind? Can God change? Period. Many of us hold a view of a God who is unchanging, eternal, unchanging, da-da-da-da. We used to sing about it. God the all-powerful, unchanging, eternal. A God who is unchanging and indifferent to the world. Anything going on in the world, as though God were like a plastic fixture, a fixed entity. But that's not the God we learn about in the Bible. It's not the God of Israel, the God of Jesus, whom we follow. That unchanging God is more the God of the church, who likes to hold power and control over people. Because the church can tell you, well, God is exactly like this forever and always, eternal, unchanging. Therefore, we have the answers, and you need to put some money in the plate, and you know how it goes. That's not the God we discover when we dig into the text. God is a God of development and progression, a God whose heart changed numerous times as history unfolded. A creative God is a flexible God. Israel's God is fully a person who hurts and celebrates, responds, and acts. A God who hurts, celebrates, responds, and acts in remarkable freedom. You know, I've spoken in the past about the prophets using the term, and yet, the phrase. It'd be like God's blustering. The prophet Isaiah says, all this anger from God. And yet, God says, I will love you forever, and goes on into this all soft, lovey-dovey stuff that God likes to say through the prophets. And yet, throughout the whole of the prophets, and yet shows us a God who does change and shapes with the predicament that humans get ourselves in. Well, Bergman says, great Hebrew Scriptures teacher, says that the crisis in the story is not the water, which is very dramatic, we have to admit. The crisis becomes the resistant character of the world, which evokes hurt and grief in the heart of God. The crisis is in the heart of God. Chapter 8, verse 21 and 22, we heard it a minute ago. The Lord said in his heart, never again. Smelled the smoke from the altar and said, in his heart. That's how you know the actual story takes place in God's heart. It's happening to the earth, and there's this flood and all this kind of stuff. But the real meaning, the real story, the real thing of concern for us is what's going on in God's heart. A sorry God, a grieved God, a God who speaks inside his own heart. In this story, the world is not brought to trust and obedience by God's demands or God's anger, but rather the reconciliation is done by the anguish and grief of God, who enters into the pain and the separation, the fracture of the world. And the world is brought to the rule of God, but only through the pathos, the emotion, and the vulnerability of a Creator who feels the grief and changes the divine mind. Let's talk about Noah for just 1 minute, because then there's Noah. In a world that was corrupted, and it's interesting, the Hebrew word for sin, and the humankind was evil and sinful, is the Hebrew word for corrupt. And the word that was used for destruction, God, the flood will destroy the earth, is the same Hebrew word, corrupt. So you could just link the corruption of the people and the corruption of the earth through the flood are linked inextricably. The world was corrupted. In a world that had turned against God's desires, there's Noah. 3 times it says that Noah did as the Lord commanded. In a world where everybody else was doing exactly not what the Lord commanded, there's Noah. One guy does what the Lord has commanded, righteous and blameless in all of his days. The flood didn't actually change the rebellious nature of humankind. There's no apologies. The people didn't turn around. It doesn't say Noah learnt the lesson and apologized on behalf of humanity. There is no change in humankind's heart. And in fact, God says at the end, I still understand that the human heart can be evil and do bad things. But the flood has caused an irreversible change in God, who will now approach creation with an unlimited patience. This story helps us realize that the relationship is not between a strong God and a needy world, but between a grieved God and a resistant world, resistant to the love. God's righteousness doesn't come through judgment, but through incredible compassion. God turns around, turns back, and toward humanity. Never again, as the bow was set in the sky, God says, never again will I do such a thing. Never again will I let my anger reign. Never again will I take up the weapon of anger, as one writer said. The bow is laid across the sky as God lays that weapon down for good. How did the change happen in God's heart? What happened while the flood was going on? Well, it says that God's heart is changed through remembering. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. But God, and yet, it's almost just like that. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and the cattle that were with them in the ark. It's God's remembering that changes things. Because for God to remember means God is not a self-interested God, like some of the ones we might have learned about in grade 8 mythology, Apollo and Zeus. Self-interested, petty gods. Not our God, not the God of Israel, the God of Jesus whom we follow. The remembering of this God teaches us that God is not self-interested, but is a God who constantly turns towards relationship, who remembers covenant and promise and partnership and acts with compassion. The only things that the waters of chaos and death do not cut through, and they cut through everything in the story, the only thing they did not cut through is the commitment of a loving God. This is a God of faithfulness. God remembers, and God turns towards. We say so much about God to each other, to our kids, to our children. We say, oh, God will provide. And we have all these little pithy statements about God. Those who sing, pray twice, How about making our mantra this fall, God remembers? Because that's the God of Jesus. God remembers. God turns toward. God desires relationship with us, even when we're not ready, even when we turn away, even when we think we don't deserve it. God remembers. Amen.